Coming up, the wait is over and the preseason is finally upon us for Brooklyn this week. We talk about Jordi Fernandez and his new plans for the backcourt that, yes, involve Ben Simmons and Dennis Schroder. We dive in coming up next.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, my friends, it is the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. He's Doug Norrie. I'm Adam Armbrecht. We thank you, as always, for making us your first listen of the day. We are 100% free on all those great platforms. And let you know, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Continue to kick off that NFL season with $5 bets that get you $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started today. And Doug, finally, as we'll talk about the impact for the roster overall, we get some news and notes, and training camp's been going on, and we've got all these veterans, and there's all these rookies we're excited about. But who's going to play? Who's going to start? Who's going to be in the backcourt? Jordi Fernandez revealing some plans, at least for preseason game number 1.
Yeah, you know we're ready for basketball when there's hotly debated topics like who's winning the Nets free throw contest in during
Jordi believes in
camp.
fun, Doug. Because Jordi believes in fun.
But they're going to walk into this first preseason game playing. Basically, Ben Simmons is going to start and Dennis Schroder is going to start as well. And they get a little helped here in that it's not helped, but that Nic Claxton is not able to play. So I think like it's one of these decisions that it ends up becoming an easier decision because once Claxton is out, you're not worried about having to do it. They had so many examples like this last year too, where they just got bailed out on like more difficult decisions about who was going to start. But it looks like it's going to be Simmons plus Schroder. And I think we can make an assumption that the rest of the lineup is like Cam Thomas, Cam Johnson, and my guess is like Dorian Finney-Smith, right? And that's the starting 5. And it'll be interesting. I mean, this is what we'll talk about today is like how these guys, is there a world where these guys do fit together?
Well, I did want to say there, as you mentioned, this feels all too familiar. You know, last season or over the last couple of seasons, it was always, well, what are you going to do if, when? And a lot of it was around Ben Simmons and then the fit with Nic Claxton. You go, oh, well, it turns out player X is injured. Oh, sorry, they can't make this game. And all of a sudden the answers got kind of solved for you. And we often reference that when it came to the coaching staff and saying, would we be able to judge Jacque Vaughn on the choices he was making? And then it became, well, by default, we can't really say for sure. In this instance with Jordi Fernandez, even though it is a byproduct of not having Nic Claxton be available, I do feel like there's something coming into this preseason where Jordi Fernandez is curious about the different combinations, curious about how guys can play on the floor together. And when you talk about pace of play and wanting to play up tempo, as most versions of the Nets in recent years have wanted to do, I think there's something interesting about having both these players on the court in this first preseason game, seeing how that impacts the guys around them and whether or not you can still have as we've wondered at times, solid free-flowing offense, consistent defense, and just a system that meshes well together, because too often we've talked about clunky basketball for the Brooklyn Nets as opposed to free-flowing, something that Noah Clowney referenced from Jordi Fernandez in training camp.
Yeah, so like on a high level, I don't think this is all that difficult of a decision, right? You just default, like we said many times, default to just who makes the most money and maybe who's been in the NBA longest, and that's who can kind of get this. That's who gets the start.
By the way, just real quick, I know I always knew that was going to be the case, and I spent the whole summer like railing against it just because I don't want it to necessarily be the case with a young team like the Brooklyn Nets who have these young players. But it's true. Every guy that's making the cash is going to be on the court for preseason game number 1.
And it's just fine. Like that's just fine for it to the stakes are super low this season. And so at that point, if you just have a hierarchy of making people happy based on the contract that they signed years ago, I have no really functional issue with that. It actually just makes the most sense to me. Jordi Fernandez did say about the Ben Simmons and Dennis Schroder pairing. He said, we're going to go into the first game of the preseason playing with 2 point guards. They played together. We're going to go into the first game of the preseason. Sorry, that they got repeated. It's something that gives us a different look, playing with size, but not a true big, and a lot of playmaking and shooting. So it's going to be fun to give it a look. So, I mean, he is correct, like sort of on a high level about how these guys pair together. Is it a perfect pairing? Not really. Schroeder's an okay 3-point shooter, more of kind of like an on-ball pick and roll, get to the rim. If he has an open 3, he'll take it kind of guy. And then you put Cam Thomas out there with him. It's not like you wouldn't if you were scheming it up, I don't think this would not be the perfect pairing with these two guys. I don't think. And the chance to kind of see how it goes. The key part here is to just sort of see how Simmons plays in general. Like the part where he's starting and they're saying this 2-point guards and whatever the offenses they're going to run, DHOs, or if they try to do some pick and roll with him, I guess that's like 1-1 pick and roll if they're calling them both point guards. Like, there's, if you want to try to run some pick and roll because you think Simmons wants to get to the rim, stuff like that. And there's no Claxton out there and you're playing without a true center. I think that could be it could be interesting with probably the key point where we'll divert, focus all of our attention is how healthy Simmons just looks in general, right? Like how confident he looks. And I think from that standpoint, having him in the starting lineup is good also, because I think it'll just give us a quick blink test around, oh, hey, how does he look? Is there fire worth all the smoke that he pushes all season, all preseason long and all off season long? I think that'll be the most interesting thing.
Yeah, well, I want to get into a little bit more the fit and what it can mean off of it, and then just some combinations we can expect. But to your point, I think small sample sizes is a big part of what you're going to take away from the first preseason game for the Brooklyn Nets. That's tomorrow night. Excuse me. It's going to be: does Ben Simmons look healthy? Are these guys able to run the floor together? What are some of the new things that Jordi Fernandez wants to do on both ends of the court? Because those are the biggest questions that we've been asking all summer. While you can look back at what coaches have done other places or what other players have done other places, until you see them on the court together for Brooklyn, it's a little bit of ambiguity. And this first sample size, in theory, could give us a path to how the season could start, especially when we already heard Jordi Fernandez also make mention of something like a Nic Claxton and Ben Simmons combination reemerging. So I think small sample sizes that build up to a perspective on the season coming up for the Nets is what we're going to start with when we get a look at this tomorrow night. Coming up here in a second, though, what would be one of the pitfalls of putting these two players on the backcourt together? A little set there that Doug talked about that could wreak havoc for Brooklyn. We'll dive into that here in just one moment.
All right, before we get to that, let you know the show's sponsored by BetterHelp. Look, what's something that scares you? For me, Adam knows this too. The heights, baby. The heights thing is just something I'm never going to be able to get over. But this is where therapy can come in. And sometimes you're thinking about things that scare you. Halloween lets us have a little fun with things that scare us. But sometimes those fears don't involve the zombies. They don't involve the ghosts. They involve the stuff that's kind of going maybe shooting around in the back of your mind, or maybe even the forefront, like me when I'm standing at the edge of a cliff. Therapy is a great tool for facing your fears and finding a way to overcome them. Sometimes the scariest thing is not facing our fears in the first place. Then we're just holding ourselves back. Look, if you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It can help with all of this. It just helps to talk to someone, folks, especially when it comes to talking to a professional. It's entirely online. It's designed to be convenient. It's flexible. It's totally suited to your schedule. You just fill out that brief questionnaire. You're going to get matched with a licensed therapist. You're going to switch anytime, really, too, with the therapist. It's made for you, and it's for you. There's no additional charge to switch. Overcome your fears with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA today to get 10% off of your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNBA.
All right, so as we continue today's Locked On Nets episode, finally through the offseason, there will be a point, by the way, throughout this week that we will touch on the college landscape because, Cooper Flagg made his debut. And, it was pretty darn impressive. There's some things that we need to talk about in terms of the long-term outlook for the Brooklyn Nets. When we talk about Dennis and Ben being in the backcourt together, you mentioned something there in the first segment of, well, will Schroder get towards the rim, be able to drive and kick? And this isn't really a large-scale problem. But it makes me chuckle to think about Schroder to the basket, kicks it to Ben Simmons, and what happens, off of a play like that, as opposed to the reverse of it, which can make a lot of sense. Pushing it in transition with the ball in the hands of Ben Simmons, and then you have Dennis Schroder there, and then when he gets the ball in his hands, he can make that secondary. Do I want to go ahead and take the penetration that Ben Simmons has created for me and pull defenders out of the way? Now I can still go at the basket. Now I can make a secondary pass. So I think having the ball handling and the facilitating in those two players is good. There are going to be the order of who has the ball when creates, I think, different either benefits or potential issues on the offensive end of the court.
It'll probably look a little clunky or a lot clunky. I think that's just going to be, that's fine, right? And also, too, I mean, one thing to consider also, and I was kind of saying it from a money perspective to start, but it actually plays out in talent-wise, too. I mean, these are the most talented guys on the team too, right? Like Ben Simmons at 80% or whatever is still better than really almost everybody else on the Nets roster also. So if you're just talking purely talent-wise, if you're just saying, hey, who are the 5 most talented guys, and maybe we're leaving off Clowney, and I'm not even sure that's totally correct yet because he hasn't really even played tons. I mean, are we really, is there anyone that's like even being left off the list here that's on the current roster? Claxton's out. So the answer is pretty much no. And so I'm not even worried about it from that standpoint. When it comes to pace pushing, I mean, Schroder's not exactly like a fly up and down the court guy, but Simmons is. And if you think that the other shooters like DFS and Cam Thomas around him is good enough to pace and space, then I think there will be moments that should, I mean, and that's funny too, because Cam Thomas is not exactly a pace pusher either, but I think there should be moments here where they're pushing after makes, pushing after misses, and you probably get glimpses of like, ooh, this could be exciting. And I think that could be, right? Like if Simmons looks okay, if Simmons looks even okay, then that should be a lineup that is able to do some damage or at least get good looks, whether they go in or not. And I think that's a pretty exciting prospect.
Sorry there to cut you off. I think, the defensive side of this particular type of lineup that we'll get into here in a minute. The other part that I do find interesting in terms of sample size would be Cam Thomas in this type of lineup, because what you're saying in this version of it from Jordi Fernandez and the sample you want to get, you're not talking about Cam Thomas really having the ball in his hands in terms of running the offense or setting things up. You mentioned about the pace of play. I think this is a good thing, by the way. Hey, let's put out a sample where Cam Thomas's role is going to be on defensive sets, try to be that speed bump. We talked about it all last season too, in terms of the weaker aspect of his game. And then when it's time, off of a make, off of a miss, because we know how much Ben Simmons wants to push tempo, your job is not going to be to worry about maybe getting the ball into your hands. It's going to be about getting out on the wing, spreading and spacing the floor, and waiting for your opportunity. Like, it's going to be more of a Cam Johnson mentality when it comes to transition basketball, potentially for Cam Thomas on certain sets like this. I don't think that's a bad thing. We heard Jordi Fernandez talk about when he dribbles less, that's a good thing. That's true for all players in general. We heard Cam Thomas make sure we understood that depending on where the shot clock is, he has to do some things he may not want to do. Do you think that this is at least a good baseline, understanding not having Claxton, that one of the things we want to see more of is getting guys into different looks, getting guys into different roles, and asking more of a young player like Cam Thomas to say, you need to continue to be set by set, play by play flexible to create the best version of the offense and not have it be this era where we had stagnation and Cam Thomas by himself with the shot clock winding down, or plays where it felt like there wasn't a clear path for him to be involved.
Yeah, I mean, if Simmons is going to be in the court, you really can't play slow. Like, he's not really a half-court guy. Like, he's just not really a half-court player. When
he'll be in the backcourt while he is somewhere trying to push up and, attacking at the basket potentially.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like he can't do it, but it's not his ideal role. Like, his ideal role is to get if he's healthy, besides his transition, it's to get the ball at the top of the key and try to get downhill against a primary defender, or, come out of the dunker spot, come up and set a pick, and like see what you're going to be able to do. DHO some stuff where you can flash a DHO and then flash back to the basket if the defender overcommits. I mean, these are the things that Simmons does well. It's not really tradition. It's not how a lot of other offenses run, though. Kings ran a lot of this with Domantas Sabonis, and maybe if Jordi Fernandez is like, hey, he's going to be like the Sabonis in this kind of like, Sabonis version a little bit, except he can't shoot like that. There are other kind of things they can do that should benefit Cam Thomas, you would think, if it can be run correctly. The problem you sometimes run into is when Simmons is playing with his back to the basket, or basically just that. If he's playing with his back to the basket and he's not really trying to get into the paint and attack the rim, it does get super clunky. We saw this at times, really a lot last season, right? It's like when he's playing like that, when he's not aggressive, when he just kind of wants to hand you the ball at the top of the key with a little, as you come off a pin down, or you're running like a little pistol action or something like that, and he wants to just give you the ball. It's kind of like it's make it or break it. You don't really have tons of options. So, these are the things I really want to see. If it's running well and it has high fluidity, then Cam Thomas should for sure benefit from it.
Yeah.
But it's also just one of these things I think we just know quickly too. Like I'll say this with Simmons. We always just kind of knew. We just knew right away. You just knew right away. Like, you just knew right away if it was in his head or if it was not in his head. More times than not, it was in his head with this stuff when he got into the half court, and you could just tell right away. And this is why I hate to make blanket judgments off of very small sample sizes of stuff. And we're not going to just call it a season based on the first 5 minutes of this game for sure. But with him more than most other guys, the things he does well, you have to kind of see it right away, because I do think it's a mental aspect more than anything else. It's like, it's a mentality more than it's a skill thing for him a lot.
Yeah, and whether or not we think that he's gotten a little bit older and maybe he's not quite the same player that he was ever going to be, he'll never get back there just with all the injuries, even if he is 100% healthy. There is that part of it you mentioned last year when we would see it and say, oh, okay, whether or not he was 100% healthy, whether or not he was mentally 100% locked into feeling good enough to do the things that you want to do on the basketball court, you could see it. The attack just wasn't there. So I think in the first handful of minutes, a handful of possessions, there's going to be a transition opportunity when Ben Simmons has the defense that is not set. The lane's going to open up. And we saw one of these last year, if you remember, because it was like kind of one of those moments in the post game we talked about and went, oh, if Ben Simmons is going to throw down a couple of transition jams with authority, and then we never saw it again because it was only 15 games. But if you can see that ability for him to attack at the basket, to play above the rim, and to do it once and twice and 3 times, and to play with the confidence of, as we saw over these last couple of seasons, the willingness to do that, to attack on the offensive end, knowing I may get fouled, I may go to the ground, right? I'm in the free throw line. We all understand that that's not going to be his bread and butter, and it's not going to turn around overnight, but at least the willingness to do that, because the injuries, if we want to just put it solely on that, clearly made him contact adverse on the offensive end of the floor for the bulk of this time here with the Brooklyn Nets. And you can understand that if you don't feel like physically you could sustain blows like that, getting knocked down to the court, and then still being able to get up and play through X amount of minutes per night, game after game. So that will be one of the first eye tests that matter here too. If everything he says, and I'm not saying this argumentatively towards what we've seen, but if everything that Ben Simmons has said this offseason about his health is true, then you will see a player that physically looks confident and free-flowing, especially on the offensive end, attacking at the basket. And that says nothing for what maybe our expectations are defensively for him, especially in at least a first glimpse lineup like this, which is not going to have a true big on the floor. Ben Simmons is that guy, but it's going to put a lot of demands on him on both ends of the floor in this type of lineup.
Oh, yeah. I mean, we got to talk about defensively here in a second. Actually, yeah, we'll talk about this here in a second, because I think there's going to be a defensive, and I actually have had greater confidence in him on the defensive end more than anything else since his time back. So we can talk about here. We'll talk about that and maybe what some of the other plans are here in a second. First, I'll tell you about our friends over at FanDuel. It's America's #1 sportsbook. For NFL fans, you get the season started, and maybe even keep going with a big return on FanDuel. You get a hunch in the middle of the game. You check out the latest stats, and you get to view the live play-by-play. So much more. It's going to be on the same page where you make those bets every Sunday, Monday, Thursday. The NFL's going all the time. It's also going all the time at our friends over on FanDuel. You get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed to get you started. You just got to place that first $5 bet. You heard that right. You place a first $5 real money bet, you're going to get $200 in bonus bets over at FanDuel.com, America's #1 sportsbook.
All right, so as we wrap up today's Locked On Nets episode, talking about expectations, new looks for lineups here for Jordi Fernandez, as we expect the first-year head coach for Brooklyn to try a lot of different things. I do want to get to what it looks like for some other players coming off the bench here. We talk about Noah Clowney, but defensively, is it the health that makes you feel more confident in something we didn't see from Ben a lot last year, which was like quickness and fluidity? Like it seemed like he had, as from the eye test, was always lost a step defensively, and it's just not as dominant as you want him to be when we talk about switching opportunities and really being able to cut off guys at the point of attack. He was a step slow there. Is speed and quickness and just looking healthier the thing that you're most excited about for him on that end?
Well, I actually I thought his defense was like okay last year. I thought he brought it more on the defensive end than he did on the offensive end. I think there was a lot of ticky-tack fouls. Some of them I think were frustration. Some of it was him being just super aggressive. Right. He was being over aggressive. And maybe just like his instincts were slowed down a little bit based on just not enough court time. But I always thought the defense looked way, way better than the offense, mostly because I think the defense requires much less of a mental effort. And unfortunately, I just think I go back to what I said about the offensive piece of the game. I think there is a massive mental component for his game here, which doesn't come through as much in the defensive end because it's just more instinct and speed and length and all this other stuff. And so I think that when it comes to Simmons there, I have way more confidence within the defensive end. Again, there was times where he had the stupidest fouls in the world, and it was really, really frustrating. And there was a couple times it seemed like he was just trying to foul out. But in general, I thought that part of his game translated a little bit more because I think that he's in his head at times, was in his head about the offensive stuff, didn't want to get to the rim, didn't want to get to the line, was worried about finishing at the basket. The floater looked really stiff. Like he was just, it looked bad. It looked bad on offense. There's no other way to put it. But if you attribute that to a mental piece more than maybe a physical piece at times, or a physical piece leading to a mental piece, then that just doesn't come through in the defensive end as much. I'm way more bullish of him defensively than anywhere else.
Oh, no, of course. Yeah, I don't want to put it as, and I'm more excited or more confident in his offensive game than his defensive game. I think you kind of touched on it there, where last year you remember those moments, and maybe it was. I always think we talked about this a little bit about players of a certain caliber who have played at a certain level in the NBA, and that comes down to, hey, I'm playing aggressive defense, right? And I normally don't get called on calls like these because reputation precedes you and you're allowed to be a little more dominant and you're looked at as a player who swarms guys on that end of the court. So maybe there was just a frustration aspect there as opposed to what I was labeling it as being, well, you're a little bit step slow and you're trying to get to that spot or you're trying to make that reach in play and you're getting called for the fouls and you're physically not able to do what mentally you want to do. I do agree with you 100% though. I think it's a really good point that you brought up about how much easier it is for Ben Simmons to operate on the defensive end. That is set and forget. That's natural. That's where he wants to live. Whereas the offensive end of the floor is always going to be more of a processing power as outside of that transition game. We know that part, even that looked good last season for the Brooklyn Nets. It just comes down to if you have to settle into a half court set, if you have to make some of those decisions going towards the basket, what is it going to mean for you from a physical standpoint for Ben Simmons? The other thing that I think is interesting here is the different combinations we may see off of this. When Jordi Fernandez says we're going to get a look at this new backcourt, it could be the first 4 minutes of the game and we may never see it again the rest of the night. Like there's a lot of other things that are going to happen here. I do like the idea in the absence of Nic Claxton. We mentioned him earlier. I think Noah Clowney becomes a very exciting player to now see because we talked about seeing Nic Claxton and Noah Clowney share the court together at the end of last season, and that was very exciting. Well, guess what? Non-shooter, Ben Simmons checks that box for you. Defensive value, Ben Simmons checks that box for you. And then obviously he's even more of a facilitator and has that ability to make the offense flow. I'll be very interested to see Noah Clowney share the court with, we assume, knock on wood, a healthy Ben Simmons, because I think that can benefit Noah Clowney in a big way, especially on the offensive end, where you're talking about maybe be able to play in space a little bit more, get out in transition. And obviously we saw him coming to this season putting on 20 pounds. So hopefully he can show off a little more at that basket attacking.
Yeah, we're gonna do an episode tomorrow about like just outside of this pairing right here, about the main things we're looking for out of this first preseason game. Like, what do we want to see the most? I think a good, something good in Simmons's case here, like what's gonna help him is that with Claxton out, most of the other guys on the roster like sort of do fit his skill set. There are floor spacers here, Clowney, Jalen Wilson. There are guys that should come in and he should be able to play with without it being really stagnant. I mean, outside of Daron Sharp probably, and even he said he might shoot more threes. I think that there's
no one knows if they wanted to shoot more threes, but he said he's committed to shooting more threes.
Right. And so I think there's a world where, other combinations are going to help Simmons too. There's some world where this is like the worst one, like the starting lineup one with Schroder is the worst one. And then the other ones are the better ones. Again, like no big deal, but I think that you could probably make that case that it's like, oh, maybe this is the one of all the ones you really wouldn't want to see. This might be the one that they shouldn't do, but I understand why they would.
Yeah, and there's not a bad sense to, again, preseason games, get some of the bad ideas out of the way, right? Like put the bad ideas out first, confirm that they're not going to work or that certain combinations aren't going to benefit, and then go ahead and move on to the next iteration of it. The last thing that I think I'll close out on, and you mentioned a lot of the stuff we're going to talk about, what we're looking for on tomorrow's episode will be more youth-based and some of the development and a lot of young players obviously on this roster. But from a first preseason game standpoint, you said at the top, you follow the money, you put the veterans on the court, and it's only preseason game number one. I will be curious about how this first sample goes. No Nic Claxton, obviously. how some of the veterans look. Guess what? Cam Johnson, it's not like we have questions about what his game is, but you want to see him out there moving well. I'm curious about Dorian Finney-Smith when we talk about veterans. We haven't heard anything about Bogdanovich, so we can't bother really putting him on the table for what our expectations are. But it is I'll just say, an interesting way as we enter preseason to look at a team that we know, 3 months from now, we'll be having a much different conversation. And we know about the draft and all of these things. To hear the veteran-laden lineup that will likely be on the court for the Nets to start the preseason in this type of year is almost quintessential Brooklyn Nets. We all know where it's ending, but the journey is going to begin with a lot of guys on paper that you'd say, yeah, talented, veteran, experienced roster. It's just a funny thing that only seems like almost necessary for the Brooklyn Nets to start this journey in a similar fashion, closing out what has been so much of the last 2-3 seasons for this team.
Yeah, they just had like nothing but like weird combinations over the years, right? Like it's been wash, rinse, repeat with like a lot of these weird combinations. Some of it's been just like bad team building. Some of it's been, bad team building plus bad luck and injuries and all this other stuff. So it's not surprising here that they would start this game with maybe a less than ideal thing. Again, the stakes are so much lower now that I don't think we're not going to pull our hair. Well, you wouldn't pull your hair out, and I would proverbially pull my hair out with the situation. But
you ever put your hair in?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I wish. So I'm not worried about it in the same sense as before. I just want everyone to look healthy. Like I just want Simmons to look healthy. Like I want him to play well, and if he looks awesome, that'll lend its own probably like annoyance to the fan base about like, this, this thing coming now. And that'll open up its own little Pandora's box of maybe possible issues. But in general, we just wanted this guy to play well and not end on a sour note. And I think we'll start to see some of that here in this first game.
Yeah, I don't know if any of the fan base, how they'll react to it. Where was this 2 years ago, et cetera, when it comes to Ben Simmons?
Oh, we'll definitely hear that. I'll tell you right now. I'll tell you right now. We will not do it, but I'll say right now, if he comes out and looks awesome, you will for sure hear that. Like there's just no way around it. I'll hold us to the thing that we will not take that tact about being like, of course, or whatever. That I think is not. There's no gains to be had by it. But if he looks awesome, I'm telling you right now, there will be a contingent of people that will A, say, oh, of course, or B, say it's only happening because
contract
this
year.
other because the situation's different or whatever. So anyway, maybe me just doing that right now counts as us saying that. Okay, fine. But you'll hear that for sure, I think.
Yeah, and I'll be happy to see Ben Simmons, like you say, healthy on the court and playing good basketball. And we'll get into all that and more for this first preseason game on tomorrow's episode as well, talking about the young players on this roster. So stick around for that tomorrow as well.
All right, make sure you subscribe to Locked On Nets wherever you listen to podcasts. Make sure you subscribe over on YouTube as well. Let's get us to 8,000 subscribers. We'll be here all season long, breaking down every game, such as it is. Preseason, regular season, no postseason. That's okay. Draft too. Make sure you subscribe to Locked On Nets.
Nothing is impossible. The word itself says, I'm possible. And that is Audrey Hepburn.
One of the all-time great poets. We're back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.